Welcome back to Telltale. This is that promise number 2 video about years that made a big difference in literature and science fiction. I think, and just like the first one for 1939, it's impossible for me to say that everything that happened only in the space of this 1 year. It does stretch before and after the chosen year, but the chosen year is kind of like the pinnacle. And that year, in this case, is 1953, and that's really what started me thinking about a series of videos of important years, is because I was looking at the listings of awards. I was looking at the titles of books that came out. I was compiling our top tales list initially and noticing that 1952, 53, 54, there were a lot of really, really landmark works being published. And whenever you have a phenomena like this, where there's a short space of time that a lot of exciting things are happening and before and after not so much, it makes you start wondering what was happening sociologically that might have caused this. This particular one is not that hard, really, because leading up to the 1950s, leading up towards 1953, what do you have happening? You had World War II, a very big thing, which did cause, because of resources for the war effort, a lot of things saw shortages. And yes, there was a paper shortage. And that forced a lot of magazines out of business. It forced other magazines to reduce their circulation schedule. So you saw magazines going from monthly to bi-monthly or even quarterly for a while. Some magazines stopped and came back after the war. And of course you see a dip in the productivity of the writers during the war, because a lot of them did go into the armed services during that time. So after 1945, you have things starting to pick up again. But then something happened in 1947, which was a game changer that really affected science fiction in particular. And that was Kenneth Arnold's report of a UFO. Before then, there were stories of flying objects, strange cigar-shaped objects or saucer objects or lights in the sky, but those didn't get much attention. In 1947, however, with the huge growth in technology during World War II, especially the growth in air technology, and a lot of people, you had rocketry. You had rockets being blasted off by the Nazis. The Nazi scientists came over here and were testing the V-2 rocket here in the United States. So there was a renewed interest in going into outer space and what might be coming from outer space. If we can go into outer space, why couldn't creatures from another planet also go into outer space, and if they're ahead of us, travel across the light years to visit Earth? And so this weird spaceship might be aliens from another planet, might also be some kind of super secret project with the Air Force, because of course with the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, everybody learned that our government developed these bombs in secret. What else were they working on? And so people's minds started to really speculate about science and technology and the future and the universe. A whole new concept had been opened up for the general public. Scientists knew about this stuff before, but now the average guy on the street suddenly became aware of these things. So by 1950, you had the release of a number of science fiction movies like Destination Moon, Rocket Ship Galileo, When Worlds Collide, The War of the Worlds. Lots of science fiction movies being made. You saw the advent of paperback publishing. That was a big deal. And the advent of a number of small press publishers that specialized in science fiction and fantasy, starting with Arkham House back in the late 1930s, but in the late 1940s it really got going with Gnome Press and Fantasy Press and Avalon and Shasta. They started publishing a lot of science fiction, and the paperback books became popular during the 1940s, and by 1950 a lot of publishers were publishing paperbacks. Dell, Ballantine, Ace, Pocketbooks, and they were publishing a lot of paperbacks. And with all this interest in UFOs and outer space, they saw the popularity of science fiction with the movies. They wanted science fiction books in their paperbacks lines. And another thing that resulted from all this interest just before 1950 was a lot of science fiction magazines got started up at this time. I mean, in the 1940s, you had Amazing, you had Weird Tales, you had Astounding, you had Astonishing, and Planet Stories, and there was Thrilling, Wonder, and Startling were all going through the 1940s. But before 1950 and just after 1950, you saw this huge wave of new science fiction magazines led by the beginnings of Galaxy Science Fiction and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Now, a lot of these magazines that popped up at this time only lasted for a couple of issues. Some lasted as little as one issue and then became defunct. Others lasted a few years and became defunct. But just the sheer number of magazine titles that suddenly hit the newsstands, cashing in on the popularity of science fiction was astounding. So you had this demand that needed to be fed, and you had a lot of science fiction writers getting their start. So you saw people like Philip K. Dick, J.G. Ballard, Harlan Ellison, Robert Silverberg, and a whole host of other authors suddenly appear and start writing. And they were teenagers still, but they started writing. They wanted to write. The demand for new stuff was there. And the older science fiction writers, of course, they were in their prime. They were still publishing regularly. Asimov and Heinlein and Clarke and all the others from the 1940s, they were still writing and still writing their best works. But the immediate need for science fiction and publishing prompted the science fiction writers to take advantage of it. And they had all these old stories that were published in the magazines. The stories, as they were published, they sold the rights to the magazines. So the magazine held the copyright. So the authors couldn't just take them and throw them in a collection and publish them. They would have to get permission from the magazine to do that. Well, there's a way around that. They take a bunch of stories that they wrote, related stories that they wrote through the 1940s, rewrite them a bit, and string them together to make a single novel. Now it's a new work, and they hold all the rights, and they can sell everything to the paperback publisher or to Gnome Press or whoever, and make all the money without having to pay anything to the magazines or get any special permission from the magazines. And it allowed them to very quickly cobble together novels in a very small fraction of the time it would have taken to write a whole new book, which satisfied the publishers long enough that they were able to then sit down and write novels. So you had a lot of these fix-up novels coming out, like the Foundation Trilogy, The Martian Chronicles, The Weapon Shops of Isher, City by Clifford Simak. Going back to 1950, you had a lot of new stories being published as well. Some of the notable ones are The Little Black Bag by C.M. Kornbluth, The Mindworm by C.M. Kornbluth, like I said, The Weapon Shops of Isher, a fix-up novel published in 1951. The Sentinel by Arthur C. Clarke was 1951. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was published in 1950, followed by Prince Caspian in 1951, and I think he published a novel a year after that till the end of that series. The Marching Morons by C.M. Kornbluth is 1951. The Foundation fix-up was published in 1951. Heinlein published The Puppet Masters in 1951 after publishing a number of juvenile novels that were very successful, starting with Rocket Ship Galileo and continuing with books like Space Cadet and Red Planet and The Rolling Stones. Foundation and Empire was 1952. Outside of science fiction, The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. You got to remember, Ernest Hemingway and John Steinbeck were writing some of their best works at this time still. Philip K. Dick started writing with Beyond Lies the Wub in 1952. More Than Human was published in 1953, and also in 1953 was Childhood's End, Fahrenheit 451, The Big Jump, short story Second Variety by Philip Dick, short story The Defenders by Philip Dick, Second Foundation, some more Philip Dick stories, Imposter and Paycheck, names. It's a Good Life by Jerome Bixby was 1953, and moving over into 1954, spilling over into 1954, saw the publication of The Fellowship of the Ring and The Cold Equations by Tom Godwin. 54 also saw The Two Towers. So in that short period of time, most particularly 1952, 1953, 1954, there were so many truly landmark books being published, especially in the science fiction genre, but also outside the science fiction genre. It was like a renaissance happening in publishing. It was a pretty remarkable and exciting time, at least from where I'm sitting now. I didn't live back then, so I don't know what it was really like, but looking back at what came of those years, it is just extremely exciting. Oh, and I should say also, I can't remember what year it was published, but William S. Burroughs published Junkie in the 1950s. And moving into 1955, you've got Lolita by Nabokov. And other really excellent science fiction authors, a lot of them from Britain. Big increase in the number of British science fiction authors in the 1950s, with Arthur Clarke, Brian Aldiss, J.G. Ballard, Michael Moorcock, E.C. Tubb. I mean, lots and lots of British science fiction authors. It was almost a British invasion starting up And yes, they were publishing in American magazines as well as in magazines like New Worlds, which got its start in the early 1950s. And Science Fantasy got its start. It was a companion magazine in New Worlds. So it was just a very, very exciting time, kind of centered around 1953. So that's my number 2 video. I need to identify some more years like that. If you got suggestions, let me know of other years that you think really stood out in changing either the science fiction genre or the fantasy genre or the horror genre or literature in general. Let me know. I gotta put my mind to it and come up with some more for these series. They're kind of interesting to think about. So till next time, I hope you enjoy whatever you're reading, whether it was from 1953 or not.